speakers. The first speaker is Prof. Garth Stevens. I'm not going to introduce him because I think everyone's heard from him already yesterday. His presentation is on borders, bodies, and barbarism, new statecraft, othering, and the possibilities for violence in contemporary human mobility.
Thanks, Taz. So this is probably going to be a slightly different kind of emphasis from the previous session. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
And as the title of my paper really suggests, I want to talk a little bit about global migration and violence in the contemporary moment. And I'm going to probably read my paper mainly because of time, and I have a tendency to kind of go off on a tangent every now and then. So I'll read my paper and we can perhaps pick things up afterwards. So maybe I can start by just saying that governing human mobility will probably become one of the most significant features of the 21st century, primarily because migration is both a consequential outcome of the period of late capital, but also because its surveillance and governance is central to an established political economy and is increasingly connected to contemporary statecraft. Violence, counter-violence, and the associated risks for bodily harm are an intractable and embedded feature of this governance regime, in my view. And so, I think for most of us, we're pretty aware of the scale of global migration today, although at some points, this is probably mobilized for motives beyond the obvious humanitarian imperatives. At the height of the migration wave in Europe in 2015, for example, refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the CAR, Sudan, Somalia, and the DRC were either making their way into Western Europe via Eastern Europe or across the Mediterranean Sea. In Central America, we saw the persistence of the Central American migrant caravans, also known as Via Crucis del Migrante, primarily composed of refugees seeking asylum and large concentrations of traditional economic migrants. We are all too familiar with the resistances to these movements of bodies in the form of tent cities and detention centers, the use of family separation policies, the killings of Muslims in Christchurch, and the shooting of innocents in El Paso as a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. We also witnessed the deaths in the Rio Grande of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria, and Alan Kurdi's death in the Mediterranean. And of course the burning man in South Africa, Nestor Alphabetto Moabe, who was beaten, stabbed, and set alight in Ramaphosa informal settlement in 1998 in a spree of xenophobic violence, or what some have referred to as Afrophobic violence. Of course, in all of these instances, people risk life and limb for a different kind of existence. And let us not forget the modern-day forms of slavery in many Gulf states today, where economic migrants continue to be exploited. The drivers of migration are deeply rooted, of course, in late capital and its consequences: war, internecine violence, poverty, inequality, climate change, drought, famine, and so forth. However, despite these very real humanitarian drivers, naming this wave of migrants as a refugee crisis requires some unpacking and perspective. Naming it as a crisis enables the work of othering and violence to be done, both of which are critical to the regulation of human movement in relation to specific political and economic projects. And I'd like to engage briefly today with the conditions of possibility that make violence, counter-violence, and embodied risks of death an almost inevitable outcome as part and parcel of this governance regime of human mobility today. So I want to cover four real areas. The one is really the reproduction of racialized othering and subjecthood inside dominant social and political responses to migrancy as a new mode of contemporary statecraft that allows violence to be enacted against those who have uneven access to citizenship rights. Secondly, thirdly, and fourthly, I suppose I want to engage with traditional conceptualizations and re-engage questions of morality and its contingent relationship to the value of human life, embodied risk-taking enactments, and affectively resonant practices that make violent, counter-violent, and self-harming encounters possible in the context of global migrations. In other words, I want to selectively explore some mechanisms through which the manufacturing of complicity and consent around violence, counter-violence, and embodied risk-taking occurs at the level of ongoing state formation, subject formation processes. So what I'm really wanting to do is to talk about the state, but I also want to talk about subjects who are constantly being formed and reformed inside that process. Within the global migration context, of course, we witness an increasing resurgence of right-wing conservatism, populism, and rhetoric of racist othering that have all become central to contemporary statecraft and the justification and legitimation of violence against minorities and migrants in particular. Now, the political economy associated with migrants and refugees is implicated not only as a driver, but as a beneficiary as well. Not only have the excesses of the dominant global financial system resulted in some of the catastrophes that I've already mentioned, but it's also contributed to human mobility in a way that has contributed large-scale human capital to the global economic project, often in deeply exploitative ways through the procurement of cheap workforce that borders on indentured labor or modern-day slavery at times, through the development of local elites in the form of protection rackets and industries that constellate around migrant communities and refugees, in the lucrative business that is human trafficking and human smuggling, or through the legal production of illegality and the ways in which this facilitates precarious labor that is simultaneously accessible and easily disposable. Walter Mignolo makes the point that this latest iteration of this political economy really involves the de-westernization and the de-globalization of capitalism. In this scenario, we have more syncretic forms of capital, as opposed to a monolithic system. North America and Europe are competing with Latin America, Africa, the Middle East and Asia within a new genre of capitalism. And of course, what we are talking about here are instances where North America, for example, contributes to about 30% of the global economy, BRICS somewhere in the region of 25%, and the EU, Western Europe certainly also in that region. This has necessitated the reborderization of the world. This is what Achille Mbembe speaks about, and ceding the narrative of transnationalism and cosmopolitanism to nationalism, ethnicism, racism, and xenophobia. Now, taking this line of argument further and thinking about its political mobilization in the United States, Coates makes the argument that what this has exposed is the historical centrality of whiteness to nationhood, which has been concealed beneath what he refers to as a patina of decency. He suggests that simply blaming the white working class as a group of thoughtless bigots and racists is a low-hanging analytic fruit that does not jeopardize the hegemonic intellectual project and belies the fact that whiteness, white supremacy, and white privilege have been at the heart of the United States of America as a social, political, and economic project since slavery. However, in moments of relative economic prosperity, the centrality of whiteness was obscured from sight and hidden behind the discourses of multiracialism, the carnivalesque notions of diversity, and of course things like colorblindness. But austerity and increasing economic pressures on whites have yielded a return to the foundational values of the United States: white supremacy, privilege, and prosperity. With hindsight, this was perhaps an easy political rebound for the likes of the Trump administration and others to literally and figuratively weaponize and capitalize on it. The point here is, rather than counterfactually viewing the current circumstance as a mere reflection of an unthinking citizenry, it is in fact a reflection of a resurgence of a set of political continuities that have been premised on race binaries, but have been cloaked since the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights movement. Of course, while I'm highlighting the process in the USA, this is true for many other contexts: France, the Netherlands, the UK, and indeed South Africa as well. Alexander Bellier makes the point that Western modernist thought has missed the centrality of the role of race in crafting the distinction between humans, not humans, or not quite humans and non-humans, and that rather than race being an effect of these conceptions of humanity, that it is in fact central to the birthing of modern Western liberal conceptions of man or woman. In other words, that race and racializing assemblages are part of the process of disciplining humanity into humans, not quite humans, and non-humans, right from the very onset of Western modernity. Stated differently then, he cites Dorothy Roberts' profound assertion that under these circumstances, race is not a biological category that is politically charged, but it is a political category that is disguised as a biological one. Of course, Lear's contribution, like Coates, is suggesting a deep historical analysis. And of course, an analysis of race, statecraft, and violence. What we see today is not simply discursive repertoires of racist othering of black minorities, but is a return to deeply entrenched notions of who is human, not quite human, and non-human. This transcends the realm of symbolic racism, the culturalization of racism, or even entitlement racism, but reveals a direct connection to scientific racism and racial hierarchies associated with slavery. It is no wonder then that the violences historically associated with slaves, aboriginals, dark-skins, Jews, the stateless, the poor, and closer to home, of course, the undocumented, can be seen again today as migrants are tracked through high-tech surveillance mechanisms, bloodhounds and packs of dogs, all for their confinement and control, reminiscent of the Dracotomanic slaves who were the object of manhunts because they were said to be mentally ill as they fled in the pursuit of their freedom. Here, violence, of course, against migrants is not simply an effect of conservative leaders and unthinking citizens. It is, in fact, a historical recapitulation of a very old story arc. So the point I'm making is that violence is one mode of regulation of human mobility, but it's not the only one. And I suppose it's more interesting to understand what makes violence possible and what it accomplishes. In the States, for example, you have something like 50,000 Customs and Border Patrol members. Trump wanted 15,000 more and 5,000 more agents. I think ICE now constitutes or takes up something like $1 billion. There's a veritable industry around this. So the second point that I want to make of the four is really to think about how it is that we deepen our understandings of how this kind of hierarchical taxonomy of human, not quite human, and non-human functions, because it's critical to understand the mechanisms that make violence thinkable and doable. In other words, how does this translate into our subjecthood? And so my second reflection is really to raise the question of the centrality of morality within violence. Here what I'm referring to, of course, is morality as a symbolic and social resource that is deployed in different ways to either legitimize or delegitimize violence. An economy that consists of an uneven distribution of rights, obligations, responsibilities, sanctions, censures, legitimacies, and illegitimacies that different subjects may hold in relation to violence itself, and allow us the social currency to construct violence as either reprehensible or legitimate from one distinct model position to another. So of course there are a number of ways that you can think about the construction of these varied economies of morality, and I'm not going to go into many of them given time, but of course many of you are familiar with Giorgio Agamben's work on states of exception, those who stand either inside the law or outside of the law, and if you're outside of the law, really the law offers no protections. You can really be killed at any given point in time. And so ideologies of racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism, etc. are easily transposed onto such an idea where women, children, the aged, blacks, minorities, lesbians, gays, migrants may all be constituted as those who represent layers in society that have this uneven access to the distribution to life itself. So this is one way of thinking about it, but of course Fanon wrote about this, Lewis Gordon has written about this, Sylvia Wink has written about this when you're thinking about black subjects and what they quintessentially refer to as the zone of non-being, rendering black subjects susceptible to violence, objectification, commodification, and dehumanization. But of course within modern capital, prolonging life itself has become a site of capital accumulation, and while life can be prolonged and lived more extravagantly, excessively and conspicuously on the one end for some, it is also a moment in which death is ever present for others. Achille Mbembe refers to this as necropolitics, forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of the living dead. Others like Judith Butler have also done this comparison between the victims of 9/11 and the subsequent victims of the war on terror, the US invasions, and asked the kind of poignant question about what makes a life grievable. And she suggests that grievable lives are defined as those that can be mourned on the basis of them having been worthy in some way or another. But outside of that construction of worth, grief does not occur and mourning becomes moot. Violence may thus be really enacted on those who occupy such a state of exception as well. So the point here is that in such instances, subjects and objects become blurred, and it is possible, for example, for our close foreign neighbors for many years to be killed in moments of xenophobia. Performing violence under these circumstances is not merely an individual moral act, but it is a moral act that is deeply social. And theorizing economies of morality within violent enactments has to be central to understanding the value of human life and how that is determined, and how this makes violence not only thinkable, but also doable, especially against those who now occupy this new state of exception, those being migrants. So again, this idea of taxonomies of difference becoming embedded within the very fabric of morality as a social resource is of course what I'm referring to. And of course this kind of morality is contextually contingent. It is not something that sits inside of us. But then also creates a set of conditions of possibility for violence to occur itself. The third point that I really want to make is around embodiment. And despite the contemporary references to this particular account of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean, in fact, of course it's reminiscent of Christina Sharp's depiction of slave ships and their human cargo in her book In the Wake. And so while bodies are really central to violence, certainly within direct acts of violence, we really study bodies actually inside this. We study bodies in a slightly different way. We study it relationally. We count them in mortuaries, we examine case dockets at police stations or in prisons, but all in quite a disembodied way. And so the body is frequently evacuated in many approaches to subjectivity and personhood. But of course it is a site that is not only socially constructed, it's also a site in which performances and practices are undertaken, in which the subjectivity that we carry is itself materialized. And so in some ways the body is the quintessential psychosocial zone, the interface between the social and the individual. So the body can be seen as a canvas, an instrument of power, a communicative tool, a mode of reinstating citizenship, a site of destruction, and a means of reconstituting obliterated psychic space. Fanon has spoken about this in particular when he talks about how the body can be deployed as a way of reclaiming that sequestered, obliterated psychic space. In critical men studies, we've seen ways in which the value of theorizing the body as a mode of capital, for example, in the context of masculine performances of violence, overcoming fear and pain, engaging in risk-taking, putting one's life on the line, are all exemplars of the centrality of the body in enactments of violence, features all too common amongst migrants and migrant men in particular. But of course the body can also be used to call attention to a reinstatement of citizenship. Embodied displays of dead migrants, drowned infants, crying children, confined illegals, etc., can be construed as an appropriation and an enactment of bare life and a resistance to it, calling those who exclude the marginal to book and insisting on being seen as subjects with rights. Here, the kind of consciousness of deportability, precarity, disposability, and the culture of everyday fear becomes visibilized in an act of resistance and calls attention to humans in a manner that disrupts the comfortable dichotomy between those who are considered citizens and those who are considered non-citizens. A similar analysis, of course, can be used for those who risk life and limb on flimsily structured watercraft, not simply as a sign of desperation, but as a means of insisting on the reclamation of their humanity and the demands for equitable access to global citizen rights. Lauren Wilcox suggests that violence, of course, in the contemporary world runs counter to the biopolitical imperative to maintain life. Here, abject bodies that are non-citizens are obliterated. Paradoxically, when they are obliterated, they call attention to themselves in their death. This is why you get the media attention associated with drowned migrants or drowned migrant children. Contemporary modes of detention and the body also highlight the tensions between sovereignty and biopolitics. A site where there's the constant threat of death, but the imperative to keep alive. But of course, the body is also directly implicated in new modes of violence. In the context of things like drone surveillance and the consequent actionable intelligence, we see the ostensibly evacuation of bodies and the sterilization of this surveillance. But this simultaneously forges a whole new range of bodily politics, involving visual profiling to determine who is traceable, who is open to capture and expurgation, and who is not, based on particular kinds of bodies, their dress, their gender, and their movements in space and time. So again, bodies are lenses. Bodies can be seen as method. Bodies are not simply objects acted upon, but are also facilitative sites for violence themselves. So now I've probably only got about, 2 minutes, Taz? Yeah. So let me kind of move to my final reflection, and this is the area of affectivity as another component that I'm selectively highlighting as part of subjecthood and subjectivity. And so really I'm proposing a line of intellectual inquiry that involves affective and emotional practices in relation to collectively held sentiments and even hatred in relation to migrants. And of course I'm drawing on the work of people like Sarah Ahmed and Margaret Weatherall, who work on culture, emotions and affective practices. And to varying degrees, both Ahmed and Weatherall are arguing that affect and emotion are not simply intrinsic individualized processes, but are connected to other representational systems operant within the social world: discourse, semiotics, memory, history, materiality, and so on. Affects and emotions therefore have the potential to be understood as much more coherent and cogent systems of meaning-making that involve both individual and social dimensions. Again, much more psychosocial understanding and a way of bridging the private and the public. Sarah Ahmed is making the argument for an extension of an understanding of emotion, looking particularly at its cultural import, especially when they are expressed as collective waves of sentiment. In examining levels of hatred that are directed at foreigners, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, she's of course interested in the relationship between hatred and the enactment of violence and hate crime. Ahmed is at pains to bridge the interiority and the sociality of emotion, and argues for the idea that emotions such as hate are transformed expressions that attach, move through associations, and reattach across temporal moments, across a range of objects, both psychologically and socially. So, for example, profound experiences of deprivation by local marginalized groups are transformed into rage at the foreign workers who take their jobs, the foreign men who take their women, who are thus a threat, and from whom all should be protected, and are therefore hated, and thus should be dispensed with as a means of defending the nation that they so love because they've built it from a ruinous past. And you can see in those moves, in this instance, hate is converted into love, ostensibly, and the killing of a migrant becomes an act of nationalist commitment, zeal, and righteousness. This creates a cohesion or stickiness that Ahmed speaks to, and from this point onwards, it's easy to see the hated group in the body of the other, and hate crime and xenophobic violence becomes possible. Weatherall goes on to make the point, in addition to this, that of course, if you connect emotion and affect to discourse, materiality, and embodied experience, they all create a referent set of meanings. And in this moment, you have a possibility for what she refers to as affective resonance within groups, where the shared emotional response occurs precisely because it refers simultaneously to shared embodied historical and material experiences, alongside discursive repertoires of meaning making. So again, I suppose the point I want to make here is that affectivity is not simply a primordial state, nor a consequential outcome of violence, but is also directly implicated in the production of violence itself. So I'm going to kind of conclude, because I suspect that my 20 minutes are now up. And perhaps at some point during the question and answers, the discussion, we can talk a little bit about the relationship between states, violence, and subject formation processes a little further. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Our next speaker is Ellis Mushagalusa, who is a PhD fellow at SWAP here at Wits University, interested in understanding the meaning people give to violence from above and below. Ellis, over to you.
Hello everyone. As said, my name is Alice. Don't worry, Prof, I won't collapse. So, my presentation is entitled as following: Wartime rape and symbolic power, from the destruction of symbolic goods to the accumulation of symbolic power. And this presentation is based on the case study of what has been happening in the Eastern DRC. DRC, which stands for Democratic Republic of Congo, a country from which I originate. So, this will be the content of my presentation. So we have the map of the research sites. We're going to have a short introduction, and we're going to have this question I've asked: why women are targeted, And in order to answer to that question, I've been trying to analyze the rape committed by two groups of perpetrators. It's not to say that the perpetrators are limited to these two groups, but these are the main groups that have been identified by the community members. So, and the following points will be to present like women's info-politics within the research site, and then we're gonna end by a short conclusion. So, this is the African map, and then I've tried just to put in there DRC in case some of us do not know where it's located. So this is where DRC is at the center of Africa. And then on your right, you have this map of the research site. So the research has been carried out like here. Sorry. So the research has been carried out here in Bukavu, which is in the South Kivu provinces. But the conflict has been happening all along the border between these two countries, like between Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC. This part is DRC, and that other parts are the two other countries. So the main, we have two main group of perpetrators. The one which comes from Rwanda, and then the other one which is a local militia, a local Congolese militia. So moving to the introduction, before the introduction, we have the landscape of the research site. So this is where I went to carry out the research, which is a small village within the South Kivu province. It's beautiful, even if war is happening, but still beautiful. So, as for an introduction, I say that for more than a decade, the eastern part of the DRC has been a theater of several civil wars that have been characterized by the use of rape as a weapon of war. So we had, like, statistics gave like at least 30,000 rape victims like monthly, which give us an estimated statistic of 1,000 rape victims on a daily basis. So because of the extent to which war rape was expanding the eastern part of the country, that part of the country was christened like the main, like the rape capital of the world. So given like the high statistics of rape victims that were like acknowledged in that part of the country, some authors have come to call that part like the rape capital of the world. So the local population has identified two groups as main perpetrators of the rape. As said previously, we had like the Interamo group, which is a militia from Rwanda, and which was also seen as the main perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. That group, as I showed on the map, fled Rwanda and decided to locate itself in the eastern part of the country, and then were like making in place all the exertion that they could manage to do. And the second group that has been identified by the local population is this Mai group, which will be further presented in the next slide. War rape in the research site occurred in the presence of two audiences. So we had like the soldier and the community member. So the perpetrators were making sure that the rape do not occur in secret, but they were making sure that it happened in public spaces, in the eyes of other people who can watch what is really happening. So based on that, I've formulated some suggestions. The first one is to see rape, like rape is not a simple outcome of war. It's a physical violence with symbolic dimensions. It's an issue of power, both symbolic and physical, but that power does not remain unchallenged by its victim. The second suggestion is like, in both perpetrators and and the victim's community. Patriarchy is the main social norm. So because of that, rape is reinforced by women's status within that community. A statue that, of what a French author referred to as symbolic goods. That author is Pierre Bourdieu. He says that if women are subjected to those kind of violence, it's because of the statue that is given to them in the patriarchal field, the statue of symbolic goods. So perpetrator resort to war rape as a means of inferring symbolic victory upon male from the enemy group through the destruction of their symbolic goods. The symbolic goods here, which still means women. War rape is used by Congolese militia as a way of accumulating symbolic capital. But here, the symbolic capital accumulated is different from what Bourdieu suggested. So the symbolic capital accumulated here are not women, but rather the statue of an armed force, and therefore recognized by the state. The last suggestion that I've made is like, war rape has made visible the symbolic violence of patriarchal norms shared by both the perpetrators and the defending forces. As a consequence, this has planted the seed for resistance to patriarchy by women within the research site. And that the resistance that is happening, I've analyzed it as an expression of collective consciousness. So we move to this question: why are women raped? So before answering to that question, I'll try to present, to give a short history of the foreign armed group. And as I said in the introduction, so these armed groups are, which has been identified by the local population, are called the inter-armed group, and they have been also seen as the main perpetrators of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. So when they were chased from Rwanda, they decided to establish themselves in the eastern part of the country. And from there, they have been committed some exertion. And we have to recognize that they have been committed those exertions not by their own power, but sometimes in complicity with the main, the locals, the main state, the main government, the main Congolese government. So trying to answer this question, why are women raped, I've put side by side two quotes. The one which is from, the first one which is from Pierre Bourdieu, which is a French author, and the second one which comes from a male respondent in the community, in the research site. And this quote, I've put them side by side because they try to speak to each other. So the first one suggests that women are assets which, when invested in exchanges, can produce alliances. The symbolic profits they can yield partly depend on the symbolic value of the women available for exchange. And then the second quote that came from a response from a participant from this study, when I asked him, according to him, how does he explain the rape that is occurring within his community? What he told me is how can you look in the eyes of your wife and explain to her that you couldn't defend her? How can you explain to your daughter that when she was publicly and gang raped, you couldn't do anything than watching? You can repeatedly tell her that it was not her fault, but does it mean it's not my responsibility to defend the family's honor? So he insisted on the family's honor. So this is to say that the fact that this respondent saw the invasion of his wife and daughter's body through rape as an attack against the family's owner. This is to say that the act of raping went beyond the physical dimension to reach another dimension. He went up to questioning his role as the family's protector, which was undermined by the foreign armed group. So based on this, I have suggested that the perpetrators play on the commonalities between them and their victims to impose upon these later ones a form of symbolic victory, a victory which is rooted in the fact that women are reduced to the status of symbolic goods. They are seen as exchange currencies. So women in that society are not seen, I mean, they are human beings, but there is this value that are attached to them that goes beyond the physical appearance. So they are seen as exchange currencies. They have value if based on what they can bring to their families. If they can bring alliances through marriage, then they can be valued. If they are just those women who stay there without giving birth to children, so they don't have the value within that society. And then the perpetrators and the victim, all of them do understand that role given to women. And it's because of that that they choose to use rape as a means of fragilizing that society, as a means of imposing symbolic order upon the male of those society. So here, women are attacked not because they are women, but because of what they represent to the male of those society. So the attack against women are, in fact, attacks against the male of that society through their women. So this is why I've said that war rape enables the perpetrators to destroy the symbolic capital of this society. And then here, at this level, the symbolic capital has to be understood as women. We'll move forward to present the rape by Congolese militia. And this was a huge enigma for me, like when I was collecting data, because the question we can ask here is like, why people can decide to rape the people from their own community? Why can an armed force decide to rape the people that they are supposed to protect? So the first point is like our sons and brother from Europe. Why did I say that? It's because of the identities of those local militia. I have to say, for a short story, like that local militia that was identified within the research site was primarily made of young male from the same community. And then they were gathered together as a way of countering the exaction committed by the Interarmy group. So the first mission of that militia was to fight against Interarmy group so that they can chase them from their community in order to stop the rape within their communities. So they were brothers and sons from mother and sister and father from the same community. But at a certain point of time, this young male decided that they have to rape their own mothers and sisters. So why? Why can you decide to stand up today and start raping your own people? So when I was analyzing the data I've collected, what I've seen is like this Mai Mai militia, that's what they call themselves, Mai Mai, which in Swahili, Mai means water. And the beginning, like they said to have like, I don't want to call it witchcraft. They had power, and then when you shoot into water, it does not affect that water, just pass through. So that's why they were calling themselves like that, to say that they are not affected by the weapon used by the Interarmy group. So if the Interarmy group shoots them, it won't do anything to them, and they are stronger than them, so they can save their own community. But at a certain point, they have decided to resort to rape. So for me, when I was analyzing my data, I have suggested that the rape used by the local militia is the smoke that's cool. The smoke that's cool, I've stole it from Professor von Holtz, and then it's a term he used to analyze the crime that were happening in the South African society, how the young people were burning down some objects and then to use that smoke to call the attention of the central government. So for me, this militia used a wartime rape as the smoke that's called, which means that the rape they were committing were not an end in itself, but a means to an end. So the rape used by the Congolese militia was a means to an end because they wanted to call attention upon their existence. They were using rape to call the local government's attention, saying that we exist, we can also commit the same exaction like those people to whom you give attention. So we also deserve attention, we also deserve a share in the national army. So because of that, I have suggested that the accumulation of symbolic goods here is different from what Bourdieu said. So here what the local militia was using rape to accumulate a new form of symbolic capital. The new form of symbolic capital, which is different from women, because they were not accumulating women, but through rape, the perpetrators, they were not intending to accumulate the exchange currencies, but rather a new form of symbolic capital, which is attainable through the destruction of the public organized symbolic goods. So by the rape of their women, they were able to accumulate a power to place further claim, those claims which were like the demands to be included in the national army, the demands to be taken seriously, the demands to be taken as a full-formed armed group, which is not those simple people from the village, but it was a way from them to make a point that we exist and we also deserve a share in the national government. The last point that I've been presenting is like the beginning of women's resistance throughout patriarchal norms in Kamanyola. So I've said what has to be made clear here is like the resistance here takes the form of infrapolitics. The infrapolitics is defined as a wide variety of low-profile form of resistances that dare not speak in their own names. So, in the research site, more than one respondent associated patriarchal norms with the expansion of war rape within their community. So the women I've interviewed during this time, they were categorical on the fact that it's because of the patriarchal norms that define women as objects, as inferior to male, that the rape is able to be expanded in at that scale within their communities. So there were this meeting that was organized during the data collection period, a meeting, community-based meeting to which local leaders were participating, and women also came to participate in that meeting. But what was interesting is that we were in a village, a highly patriarchal society, where women are supposed to be sitting at the back of the room. They're supposed to be there on time so that they won't see them passing through to reach their places. But there were this group of women that came. Yeah, here. Sorry for the quality of the image. I was still young when I was taking them. So within this community, women were not supposed to occupy front seats. They were supposed to come earlier in the meeting if they want to participate, and go to occupy back seats. They were not supposed to speak there. They were supposed to listen and after that execute what was being said. But what we can see here, there is this woman, the other ones are sitting like there. There is that woman who came with her friends, and she made sure to arrive like 30 minutes late in the meeting. And she arrived, she took her time like to walk through the room in order to occupy that front seat. That's what, I mean, she asked people to push for her so that she could occupy that seat. And the people there on your right are community leaders. So they took the seat that faced the community leaders. And before talking, she stood up and then she took authority and started talking. That was really interesting for me because, I mean, I don't live in the village, but the time I had the chance to go and visit my grandparents there, I could see like women just hiding, trying like not to appear in public. But these ones, they stood up and then they were making sure that their point is heard. And then what was interesting is like after the meeting, I went to meet the women and I've asked them what was interesting in that meeting. And then what the one in green said, it's like, it was interesting because it was all about equality between genders. So for me, that's a beginning of resistance. I mean, it's not that huge. We cannot say that they are fighting openly the patriarchal system, but that's the beginning of something. That's why I call it infrapolitics. And besides that woman in green, there were these other women, like down here. You can see like they were standing, like when the local leader was speaking, they were just standing and start shouting, making some mouth noise, and then after that I went to them and asked, why were you making those sounds? And they said to me that he understood that we did not agree with what he was saying. We couldn't say loudly like you are lying, but with our gesture and the sound we were producing, he understood that we do not agree with what he was saying. So that was interesting for me and interesting for this study. And because of this, I want to suggest that the symbolic order brought through the patriarchal system does not stay eternally unchallenged by those who undergo that symbolic violence. And then if they are able to do that, it means that they are conscious of, they have a certain level of consciousness of their domination. Because they are they know that they are dominated and that does not serve their own interest, then they are able to do those kind of manifestations. Yeah, here we have some other pictures of women organizing public manifestation. The first one is written in French, like it's about synergy. And then here they say, "Femme, lève-toi, tu as la force," which means that women stand up, you have the strength. So they're asking women to stand up because they are powerful, they have the power in their hands, and they can challenge this symbolic order that does not serve their interest. And then on this other manifestation, you can read, we say no to rape, no to sexual terrorism, and all those other things. The one on your right is written in English. So the conclusion that we made is like, understanding the patriarchal system helps to capture the symbolic dimension of wartime rape. The public appropriation of female as symbolic goods in a highly patriarchal society constitutes the trap the perpetrators use to deeply affect, first, the victim, secondly, the community as a whole, and thirdly, the entire nation. War rape is the destruction of the study the standard community symbolic good or capital because it damages the preconceived value of women, the woman's ability to create alliances through marriage, and to some extent her capacity to offer a lineage to a potential husband through childbirth. The other points that I've made is like war rape enables perpetrators to accumulate new form of symbolic capital different from Bourdieu's. The symbolic order brought through the rape of women does not remain eternally unchallenged by the oppressed. So, merci.
Okay. Thank you. Our last speaker on this panel is Prof. Acàcio Augusto, who's a professor at Sao Paulo National University in Brazil. He's also the coordinator of the International Security and Surveillance Technology Studies Research Laboratory. Over to you, Prof.
Good morning. I would like to thank Carl and Garth for the invitation, and also Lucinda, Dylan, and all the folks, the organization team. I have prepared a short version of my paper that, apologies, I'm reading. Despite the stereotypes around football and samba, Brazil is extremely violent and unequal country with a deeply rooted authoritarian culture. Every year, agencies and institutes responsible for public safety data report what rates of violent mortality. In the last Atlas of Violence in the year, according to the Ministry of Health's Mortality Information System, there are 65,000 homicides, a rate of 21 deaths for 100 million inhabitants, numbers of an ongoing civil war. In addition to these very high mortality rates, the country boasts the third largest prison population on the planet. 7,000 inmates, 100 in prisons. Very similar to middle 20th century concentration camps. The above-mentioned characteristics of the distribution of state violence can be explained by long historical and cultural characteristics, such as colonial heritage and the effective slavery in the last country to abolish in the Americas. But also by more recent inerrancies, such as the military dictatorships, which organized and rationalized the institutional violence in the country. However, the growth of incrementation and lettering in Brazil coincides with what they called the democratic period, the senior period, in which so-called civil society and universities actually participate in the debate on security policies and even prison life. The effect of this democratization of security and prison policy was an association between security, citizenship, and human rights policies. The latter formerly targeted the prison, now in function as means of infinite reform with no effect curbing violence. They update the prison form, producing participatory citizen adherence and open-air control policies and monitoring. Above a year ago, criminal justice are expanded and democratized in the locus of political decisions. The judicialization of life becomes a vector and form of public and biological life. During the semi-period, the armed force redefined their functions, adapting to the constitutional rules of engagement, the protocols of international organization, acting the new space and choosing new strategic objectives. The citizen stands between being the object of protection on the one hand and the virtual enemy, the enemy on the other. Second states of a fair spouse, the new construction of social enemy not only degrades, but also degrades, gives new meanings to the maxim it's necessary to defend society. There was recently been a broadening of policy citizenship in Brazil. This expansion of policy conduct also as institutional repercussion, producing greater empowerment and social legitimation of the policy, be they military, civil, or federal. In addition, the armed force are regularly deployed to act as police forces, a special destacments for legitimating employment of state violence. In Brazil, from Operation Rio, the activation of Brazilian armed forces, especially the arm to the DLO, guarantee of law and order, was losing its exceptional character, taking as example the pacification of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro and so-called public safety crisis in several states of federation. It can be said that the constitutional rule of auxiliary reserve force, the Brazilian army, assigned the state military policy was reserved, making the military almost auxiliary, the meshes of governors. However, the security escalation of democracy in Brazil finds an important turning point for recent events, the recreation to street demonstration in June 2030 and follow-up the MIG events, Rio Plus 20, Pope Francis visit, FIFA World Cup, and Olympics Games in Rio de Janeiro. Under a general climate of economic and social prosperity that surrounded all these events, institutional reforms in the fields of security were carried out, starting with a reconfiguration of the policy, new equipments and special training provided by armed forces and partnership with the policy England and France, creation of new special policies battalions and regular firing of GLOs, promulgation of new anti-terrorism law, greater policy attention to video record and operation as well monitoring digital social networks, regular activation the National Security Force recently created in a structurally integrated command and control center to provide technical monitoring and control support for the operation decisions of security force. This. is military policy in São Paulo. And 2, yes. The year 2018 has become especially important for what I want to demonstrate here, with how we have seen the constitution of Securitarian Democracy. Took place during the 30 years of redemocratization and mega events, upgrade the state counter-insurgent apparatus. This year, the 3 events announce change or inflection that reaffirm a reaffirmed democracy substantiates the 6 for security. The impeachment Dilma president is very supportively against the confrontation in June 2030. And the social base, the impeachment, is still loving policy. The images, the confrontation 2030 and now in Brazil is this social base of impeachment still loving the policy. The manifestants, the protests in the streets against policy, the social base impeachment loving policy. But under the administration of President who took over after an impeachment process, a militarized constitutional intervention is intense in February 2018 in the public security folder of the state of Rio de Janeiro. Again, the justification is the called public security crisis in the state, but instead of another GOE, a constitutional device that was never been activated before used. The following month, in March 2018, a city council woman from Rio de Janeiro, Marielle Franco, is executed in the central region, the town. To this day, the principle of this clear execution is not known, but is the already know that it was carried out by members of paramilitary groups that dominate semi-regions of metropolis, que know in Brazil, militias. Is this Marielle Franco? The mobilization of troops inside the country gains the new legal form without harming the constitution, and the projects of extermination spikes 9 bullets from 9mm pistol in a figure that contains the regular targets of security violence, since Marielle Franco was a young black woman who growing up in favela from Complexo da Maré, being a city councillor, did not stop being a target. The same year, 28, majoritarian elections take place in the country in October. The winning candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain and until then an obscure congressman for the state of Rio de Janeiro, was elected with 58 million votes. In his campaign, it may said, begins since the impeachment process in which his vote in favor was cast in horror of notorious torturer of the military dictatorship period. His campaign, based heavily on digital social networks and with active participation of supporters, as well as anti-communist rhetoric and conservative customs, had as its central theme is public safety, the hunt of criminals, and the defense what he defines good citizen. In his campaign, he promised to criminalize social movements, accusing them of terrorism and promising similar treatment of the military dictatorships. Last month, with more than 6 months of his current term in office, facing a massacre of 62 prisoners in prison in Pará, in the north of country, declared his government, word of Bolsonaro, bandits will die like cockroaches in the streets. Despite the opposition of militants and politicians of opposition to the process of ground and government occupation by the extreme right in the country, 3 facts about the episode succinctly told were relevant to hypotheses of constitution of a securitarian democracy. 1. The impeachment process, even subject to change, followed the constitutional rules. Just a military intervention in Rio de Janeiro was forced in the constitution. 2. Even though perpetrated by paramilitary groups, Marielle Franc's execution, around the ephemeral and localized outrage, and the investigation follows the regular course of criminal inquiry. 3. Even though he a strong and undemocratic, authoritarian, and violent traits in the ministerial team, composite mostly of militaries, Bolsonaro was democratically elected by popular vote. This element leads to the conclusion that although in Brazil is under a precedent, authoritarianism is following a country that can be classified as democratic. More than that, they express a desire of security of most Brazilian citizens, the right to prison, question for who pursuing freedom beyond their legal and political frameworks. 1. There is a need to question the planetary consensus around democracy since the 19th. 2. Social struggles should target the security apparatus, policy, prison, country, and armed force as the target or their action, no longer as side effects of capitalist exploitation and state domination, but as insecurity struggle and disabling securitization device. Face the criminal justice, penal abolition. In the face the paranoid quest for security, self-defense tactics. This is it, or will go spinning from reform to reform without interrupting the counting of buds in prison and remorse. How many more have to die for this war to end? Thank you. Apologies for my English.
Thanks to all 3 of the presenters. They were all very engaging and interesting presentations. I'll take a round of questions. We'll do 3 or 4 in the first round and then see how many in the second are remaining. Okay, let's start from the back. Right at the back, 1, 2, Hlengi, 3 here, 4. I see all of the questions on this side. I'll come to you in the second round. So we'll start right at the back.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for the quality presentations. I'm Ashraf, I'm with the BRICS Academic Forum. I I'd like to sort of first start with the theoretical framework. I think it's for all panelists. I do understand that there are elements of the uneven development thesis that was developed by Professor Samir Amin. I think that's quite useful when one looks at the core and periphery in trying to understand violence, particularly in resource-based economies. I'd also like to add, we look into the resource curse thesis. This was developed by Professor Paul Colloquium at Oxford. And in his book, The Bottom Billion, he goes into detail that the poorest billion on the planet, by contradiction, live on the richest mineral resources. And of those bottom billion, about 22 countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it would be interesting to further look into the resource curse as a thesis. As I understand it, the DRC, Mali, Yemen, and many other nations, a lot of the conflict, besides identity and religion, is also rooted in the access to resources and how one can look into that more specifically. But I'd like to also advise that we look into the role, particularly of multilateral funding institutions, particularly the World Bank, in 25 years of lending to the extractive sector. In every zone of conflict, the World Bank has lent so-called development funding to the DRC, to Mali, to many parts of the world. How do we further problematize or critique that kind of multilateral development funding that exacerbate this violence and extractivism? So I'd like to put that forward. When it comes to BRICS, and particularly Brazil, India, South Africa, but particularly Brazil and India, there's fascinating debates within our academic network that so-called democracies, and particularly now India and Brazil, through a democratic process, we find the rise of right-wing fascists. So we have fascism, or fascists, openly fascist leaders through democracy, and corporate-backed power brokers are now in power. And so what does that mean for the democratic project when we have fascists coming to power through democracy? Does that not go back to the 30s, where the Third Reich in Germany came to power through a democratic process? I think this is part of a broader debate. And then finally, how do we look at the Chinese model, which through a lot of research we're finding that that model is still the most stable, long-term, and the model that has delivered development to its people. So I think these are critical debates that we want to throw out and then maybe look into some critical discourse. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Folo Raf Bosombo. I'm a Congolese activist, political activist. I'm happy to hear Alice about this research. I have to say to her that congratulations, we are here to support her. So, what she portrays about DRC, normally it says things which everybody are regretting. And don't forget that it's a consequence of war. It's not reflecting us in our society that we are neglecting the women. Never. There is a big improvement, and we are currently empowering the women a lot. Because when I say that I'm a political activist, yes, I was in the exile here, but now we are in power. So the current president for DRC, Felix Tshisekedi, is doing his best to empower women now. We are now 7 months without a government. There was a negotiation there between the politics people. And I think by tomorrow or by the weekend, we're going to have a government which will consist of 30% of women in the government, which never happened before. So before, in the time of Mobutu, in the Zaire era, Mobutu tried to improve, to empower women, but not in the political level. So it was not even 10% in the government to see a woman. So I'm happy to hear at least when it's about women in front politics. So to me, it's like a turning point. So men now in Congo, is trying to improve, to empower women. So by next, let's say Saturday or Friday, it should be for the first time to see out of 65 ministers, we're going to have maybe 20, 22 women. So I would like just to congratulate her and to try to encourage her, because we need this research to carry on so that it can highlight what is going on. But I want just to conclude that this is a fruit of war. It's not something which we as men in Congo, we are doing, like raping women or what. No, totally no. A woman in Congo have got a value, big value, because we grow up through our mother play a big role in society as a trader of these things. So we respect women a lot. So at least try to highlight the root of this situation very well in your statement, so that people must understand that this is the consequence of the war which they impose Congo. So it's not us, it didn't come from us, even in our culture. So these things is more specific. We've got more than 400 tribes in Congo. Yes, there are some tribes which are marginalizing women, but in general, we are respecting women. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Shengiwe. I'm a PhD candidate in associated swap. My question is to Ellis. So I understand that this is part of a broader project, and you just probably presented just a little bit of, so I might have missed some of the things over there in the broader project that you are working on. Yeah, but I would like to, there are a few issues that sit uncomfortable with me, but not because of your presentation, but because I'm invested in the same project. I'm working on something like that, on experiences of violence on women. So I would like to pick up from the colleague. We've just commented there in terms of, from what you are presenting, I'm getting kind of the same narrative that you presented and what he's saying, to say it is because of war, because you're saying, not exactly, but you say these men are making excuses that we want to be heard, the reason why we want to be heard. So I wanted to find out, what do you make from these narratives, maybe looking at everyday experiences of rape that are experienced by women, perhaps not in Congo, but elsewhere, but in particular. So that's linked to, it's not a question, but is to ask if, so you presented the experiences, the responses from men in terms of what they make out of what is this violence. But I would like to hear, how do women themselves understand what is happening to them, like this rape, what is it to them, and what does it stand for? And as a theoretical point of departure, you use a lot of Bodu, which is a useful, I think, analytical tool, perhaps as a point of departure. But I would have loved to hear what gender scholars, particularly Black women, working on issues of rape, but also from experiences from the global South in general, in terms of what are their views, maybe if you triangulate them with what you, would they still give us the same type of understanding or the same type of theorization, or their prospects for like something like that? And the last is, you presented two forms of protest from women. The one who walked up to the front to occupy space, and then those who were protesting from the back were just making noise as a form of disruption. So I read both of them as forms of protest. But obviously from my reading of African ways of protesting or African cultures, there is kind of like tensions between how the one who walks to the front becomes radical and the ones who are at the back. Of course, they're disruptive, but in more like acceptable ways. So those tensions, when they clash, forms of protest, like I would like to hear from you, what do you think about the prospects of future forms of resistance amongst women? And you concluded by saying rape looks like it's a trap. It's a patriarchal trap for women. So to link that back, what do you make of those forms of protest that you showed us in your presentation? If this is a trap, what does this mean? What does these forms of resistance mean in the future of different forms of resistance amongst women? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentations to the panel. By the panel, my name is Ntatisi. I'm a master's student in applied development economics. I really have two simple questions addressed to Alice. And Alice, you will excuse my ignorance, but I'm exactly here to learn and to understand more about some of the dynamics about binary states. So I got quite interested when you mentioned, this is my first question. When you said that the Congolese militia are raping their own women because of the share, because they want to be incorporated in the share as part of the national army. So my question is it because they have vested societal interests, like if we as the Congolese militia get included in the army, then we're going to have better weapons, better weaponry to fight the inter-army against our people? Or is it just about personal survival, like we get into the army, we get jobs and salaries, and perhaps we can still even protect our women or our people? That's the first question. Secondly is, I want to know about the babies that are born out of the rapes, because I want to understand if it's like in Nigeria where the children that are born out of being raped by Boko Haram, afterwards when you get back home, you become alienated by society for raising that kid. So what are the dynamics like in Congo? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We'll start on this side. I think most of the questions were for Alice.
Help me, Thiago, to translator.
Sure.
Dê microfone para você.
No problem.
The big comment. The first question. Países como a Índia, o Brasil, as Filipinas, que, como foi lembrado, estão elegendo políticos fascistas, é um ponto importante do que eu quis mostrar aqui.
Acàcio says that the experience such as the Brazilian, the Filipinian, Indian, where fascist presidents have been elected is one of the main points he's trying to highlight.
Que é, a segurança se tornou não apenas o principal valor dos estados, mas também dos cidadãos.
Security has been converted in one of the main values for the state, as well, of course, but as well of the citizenship.
Pelo qual se justifica qualquer tipo de medida violenta, e especialmente o crescimento das políticas de superencarceramento, de policiamento extensivo e de monitoramento dos cidadãos.
In the name of security, all the policies regarding mass incarceration and controlling, etc., are justified.
E é isso que eu chamo de democracia securitária.
And that's why he's calling
Securitarian Democracy.
Securitarian Democracy.
De maneira que se os movimentos sociais não passarem a tomar as lutas anti-segurança como centrais das suas questões,
he claims that the social movements should claim the anti-securitization struggle as their main agenda.
Construindo grupos de familiares de presos, comitês de autodefesa em bairro, ações contra a polícia em situações de protesto.
Another strategy for the social movements nowadays should be reinvest in grassroots movements or grassroots activities such as communitarian activism and support groups for victims, etc.
Enfim, se não fizermos isso, seremos esmagados pelo que me parece ser a grande novidade dessa segunda, terceira década do século XXI, que é uma forma de fascismo, como ele foi lembrado, no entanto, democrático do ponto de vista legal. Articulando aí, para concluir, articulando um Estado parecido com o que o Witwatersrand chama de Estado centauro, humano para os de cima e bestial para os de baixo, e generalizando o que o Mbembe chama de necropolítica e o dever negro do mundo, ou seja, todos se tornam potenciais alvos dessas políticas de segurança.
The main challenge for a progressive agenda nowadays should be this fascist form of getting into power, and for the progressive movements, this is a very complicated situation because nowadays this securitized democracy is highly supported by democratic elections and a massive popular support.
Thank you. Apologies for my English.
Okay, hope I survive the questions. I'll start first by thanking my Congolese fellow. Hi. Yeah. What I would like to say at first, I'm not a politician. I don't do in politics. And because of that, I have this freedom of criticizing what I see based on my own point of view, not based on my political belongings or something like that. So you've said that the actual government is trying to empower women, and maybe, I don't know, he has been there for less than a year, so I cannot judge him if he's really empowering women or not. And for me, there is a difference between occupying a seat and having a voice. So you can occupy a seat in an assembly just because they want to see numbers saying that women are in the government, but it is another thing of having your voice heard, or having even the opportunity to open your mouth and say what you think. So for me, most women who are there, they're just there to carry male's voice. And when you are used as a microphone, I don't think that you have a power. I don't think that you are empowered. So that's what I can say regarding that point of view. So you said that it's a fruit of war. That's why rape has been happening. But what I've suggested is that it's not because there is war that women have to be raped. Because the country has experienced this period, I think it was 1996 to maybe 1998, where there was this government that came in to save the Congolese people against the dictatorship of Mobutu. And during that period, rape was not a weapon of war. Rape was happening opportunistically, but it was not used as a weapon of war. It was not planned. The difference between this rape I'm talking about is that it was planned. It was among us the enemy's tool. So they were coming in that area, making sure that they pass house by house,
raping people. If they don't rape themselves, they were obliging family members to rape each other. If they don't oblige family members to rape each other, they were using their guns to shoot in women's vagina. And there were even children as young as 1 year old. I have those statistics in my MA reports that were raped. So if you are doing that, it's not because you want to satisfy your sexual appetite, but because you have a message that you want to carry. It was something which was planned, and because of that, I've said that we do not have to argue that those rapes were happening because there was war. Those rapes still happening today, but DRC is said to be in peace, but those rapes still happening today by the same perpetrators. Why? So we have to ask that question. We say that we are in peace, but in the eastern part of the country, you can go in some parts like Ituri and all those parts, Goma, Ituri, in the North Kivu provinces, where today you can be like playing, children going to school, and tomorrow morning you just see people carrying their luggage, like running because the inter-army are coming through. So why is it happening like that? So do they decide that, hey, let's go and rape today, no, today, and then let's like rest today? No. I mean, we cannot dissociate it with like economic issues, because that part of the country is very rich in like mineral gold and all those goals happening. So it's a conflict that serves not only economic interests of multinationals and all those other things. I'm not going into economic sociology. So it has a link with that, but it does not stop there. It goes beyond the economics, it goes beyond the physical. That's why I've suggested that war rape has symbolic dimensions that do not have to be put in the shadow. The other question, I think you've asked, like, what is the rape for women? So, because in my presentation it seems like I've just presented male's point of view of rape, but I couldn't say everything here because we had like 20 minutes. So I had to present, it was a way of criticizing a theory like proposed by Bourdieu. That's why I've used rape. So, but in my whole work, I have women point of view because they are the first victim of war. So, as I said in the infrapolitics section, is like women are trying to say that it's because of these patriarchal norms that we are targeted as the enemy. Because of the way the society defined us, that's why we are targeted as the enemy. So it's not as if they just agree with what men are saying, but they are using this rape to try to counter the hegemonic order, which is patriarchy within their society. So for them, if there could be an alternative to patriarchy that could serve best their interests. So I'm not, my supervisors know that I'm not a Bourdieusian person. In fact, I do fight that guy, but doesn't mean that there's no truth in what he says. There is a part of truth that he says, but I'm trying to go beyond what he says and say that, hey, look, you've suggested this, which is true, but we have to go beyond what you say. So for me, rape is not like, as I said, it's an issue of power. It's a gendered violence, as what you said, what other feminist authors said. It's an issue of power. If you get to read my whole work, I've suggested that rape is a gendered violence. It's not just, it's not male raping women. It's about inferring domination upon a certain gender. It's about making this gender look like more dominant according to that other one. It's about defining people based on two opposing poles, like male and female. It's all about that. All those things are in there. So I didn't have the chance to present them here, but if you go through my work, you can see that I've made the suggestion that wartime rape is an issue of power, is a gendered violence. You've asked about the future form of protest or resistance among women. That can be interesting for me to find out, and I hope I'll find it out when I'll be carrying on my study and finish it. The other question that was asked is like, why did the Congolese militia decide to rape their own people? Is it just to be included in the army and then that's it? No, I mean, it's about like alleviating their own poverty. For like, what we have sadly noticed in my country is like, politics is a way for many people to gain money easily and quickly on behalf of other people's life. So you get into politics, then you can get access to money. You get into army, you can get access to weapon, not to defend your own population, but to go in those mining sites and then make sure you extract more gold, more cotton, and all those other things. That is what is happening. So at the first time, they came out as this defending force. They came to defend their mothers and sisters, to chase the interim away, because the interim was in their way, was like a barrier for them to access what they were like looking for. So when the interim left, then they had easy access to what they were looking for. That's why I say that rape for them was a means to an end and not an end in itself. So they were using it as a way of gaining more power, the power to place further claims. So when they are raping, they are considered by the government, they are included, they have access to weapons, then they can have access to mineral wealth and whatsoever. So, yeah. And the last point, the last question was about the children born from war, from rape actually. Yeah, this is an interesting but sad section in my work, and I'm still developing it. But what we have seen is like sexual slavery is, I don't want to say was, but is still practiced in the DRC when these, especially foreign group come and then kidnap a group of Congolese women, impregnate them, and make sure that they don't leave the sites where they are captured without being pregnant, and they allow them to go back in their community when it's too late to abort. And most of the time they do visit their rape victims to make sure that they are still carrying those babies. If you don't, you are killed. And then to make sure that those children are born and healthy. So there is this something that is going on there. So why are they doing that? Is it just to see if the baby will come out cute or not? Or there is something that is planned there? So I've asked that question and I'm still investigating in that one. But there are these children who are born from rape, and unfortunately some community members do call them the snake's child. So their father considered to be the snake, and then they are the snake's child. Most of the time they are abandoned by their own mothers. The same mother who is chased away from her own community because she's seen as prostitute, as the soldier's wife, while she didn't choose this situation. So, and I go back to patriarchal norms because of that, the way of conceiving women as the symbolic goods. That's why they are incriminated for the crime they did not commit. So those women are chased from their own community, and most of them do even abandon these children. So I do remember, like, the last point, I remember at the time of the data collection, I went in this hospital. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's Panzi Hospital, which is the eastern part of the country, and the owner of that hospital has been recognized as the Peace Nobel Prize this year. It was this year because of the work he was doing. So I had like this chance to speak with him, and then he explained that he had this patient. She was 15 years old. She came there because she was raped, and then she was raped and impregnated. She was 15 at that time, and after that, 3 years later, she came back to that hospital, but not for her, but for her children, for her girl. She gave birth to her girl, a girl born from rape, who was also raped. And then she had fistula, I don't know if that's how, yeah. So she suffered from fistula, and then from the same perpetrators. I don't know if it was his father who decided to rape her too, but she came back in the same hospital to be treated. So when those kind of things happen, when a 3-year-old girl can be raped, what are you looking for? She wants to be pregnant. We're just trying to destroy that, the roots of those communities. That's a way of destroying those communities through the destruction of those people who are considered to be the carrier of the value of that community.
So I perhaps just want to respond to the first set of comments and questions. I think there were lots of comments by the first speaker. And of course, issues around BRICS and China and multilateral funding, World Bank support for extractive industries in parts of Africa. And I think that they're more important questions, and I suspect that they don't only speak to this particular session, but they're probably going to speak to the entire 2.5 days. So I would encourage you to kind of put that back into the conversations as we have them. But I did want to pick up on the question of fascism and its emergence, because it seems to me that violence is centrally entrenched in fascist processes, but one of the preconditions, or rather the preconditions for that kind of violence, has to be the kind of presence of othering, difference, and some level of taxonomical hierarchy that has popular support. And I suppose the question that I want to kind of throw back into the space today is whether, in fact, the kind of rise of fascism or fascist politics in many different parts of the world today isn't perhaps a contemporary iteration or a new kind of contemporary logics of many liberal democracies, and connected to particular kind of genres of contemporary capitalism that activate forms of identity politics in particular. In some ways, that run counter to moments of accumulation that were much more monolithic. And in fact, in a moment where we have much more syncretic forms of accumulation at present, where that kind of identity politics actually finds traction. And so that's a question that I'd like to put back out into the audience and for us to perhaps engage a little bit on.
Okay, we are running over time. We have just a few minutes before 1:30, so I'm going to ask if anyone has a really burning question that they can't ask the panelists over lunch. And we have just one question via the web situation. So I'll take just the one burning question here. Is it burning? Okay, so we'll take the 2 and the 1, and then I'm just going to ask everyone to be very short so that we can go for lunch.
Good afternoon. My name is K. Svanda. Okay, due to time constraints, I've got so many questions, but like the chairperson said, we should narrow, I have to narrow them. All right. My question is directed to Professor Augusto. Right. My question is, what can we, South Africa, here learn from your experience taking light of the fact that you had your former president there, Mr. Dalula, I think, yes, who is currently in prison because he was convicted of corruption. So here in South Africa, it is alleged that corruption is rampant, especially at the hierarchy, the top leaders. So what can we learn from your experience to the fact that you Brazilians yet to unearth what your leaders were doing, and what can we learn from here in South Africa? Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to go to the web question. Gemma, you can ask your question. Okay. We'll try to have you connect with whoever you wanted to ask the question to. I think that would be best. I'm just going to let you respond to the one question quickly.
I'm speaking Portuguese. Não, eu não conheço os casos de corrupção aqui da África do Sul.
He doesn't know the local cases of corruption here in Africa.
E não é exatamente preciso dizer que, por exemplo, no Brasil, ele é apenas um dispositivo de perseguição política.
It's not quite precise or quite sure to say that in Brazil the corruption cases are devices of political persecution.
No caso do processo que acabou prendendo o presidente Lula, eu costumo dizer que é preciso olhar para além do caso dele específico.
In the Lula's case, Acàcio thinks that it's necessary to look further than the case itself.
O que a maior parte da esquerda brasileira descobriu só quando Lula foi preso, como por exemplo a seletividade do sistema penal, como que a justiça é um aparato político composto por juízes, promotores que têm opiniões políticas.
With the Lula's case, a part of the Brazilian leftists figure out how the justice and the criminal justice in Brazil really works. The collusion among prosecutors, judges, lawyers, etc.
Então, isso que a esquerda descobriu só com o caso do Lula, qualquer jovem de periferia, qualquer sujeito preso com uma pequena quantidade de droga já sabia, quer dizer, que o sistema de justiça criminal ele funciona a partir da manutenção de uma determinada ordem e que, no limite, como os movimentos antiprisional no Brasil costumam dizer, todo preso é um preso político.
The leftists in Brazil found out with the Lula's case the same experience that every single young black poor in Brazil has known for a life, that the criminal justice is selective and it works to aim at a particular stratus of the society.
E para finalizar, o que eu penso que a extrema-direita no Brasil conseguiu capitalizar politicamente é um senso comum entre os cidadãos, principalmente de classe média, aqueles que estavam com a bandeira do Brasil tirando foto com a polícia, é extremamente conservadora, moralista. Então, no fundo, pouco importa se existiu ou não os casos de corrupção. A verdade é como isso foi mobilizado politicamente, principalmente para ganhar a classe média, que é algo que já foi tentado em 2006, não conseguiram, e finalmente com o processo do impeachment da Dilma, isso conseguiu ser mobilizado. Para fechar mesmo. Você sabe do que eu estou falando. Não, só para finalizar, a questão não é à toa que, como eu tentei mostrar rapidamente na minha leitura, justamente o Bolsonaro, que foi uma figura central do processo de impeachment, e que foi quem homenageou um torturador durante o processo dentro da Câmara dos Deputados, ele tinha as duas coisas que mais mobilizam o conservadorismo no Brasil, não sei se na África é assim, que é o desejo de segurança. Então, a ideia de que mesmo tendo 700 mil pessoas nas cadeias, o Brasil é o país da impunidade, e ao mesmo tempo esse moralismo em relação aos políticos, em especial os políticos do Partido dos Trabalhadores. Então não é que Lula seja injustiçado, ele só está provando do que é o sistema penal no Brasil.
Well, Acàcio said a lot of things. I am not a professional translator, so I'm trying to summarize things. And he said, in general, that let me see that Bolsonaro is a symbol of two things that mobilize the middle class in Brazil and the most conservative people: the desire for justice and security, and the anti-corruption urge. And the far right in Brazil could use this urge for the anti-corruption and the seek for more security to win the election and to fight the Works Party and the Works Party legacy. More or less, it was his message.
Só para concluir.
No.
O caso eu diria assim, não sei se eu vou me fazer entender, mas assim, o caso da execução da Marielle Franco é hoje, para mim, mais importante do que a prisão do presidente Lula, politicamente.
Marielle Franco's assassination, the councilwoman, in his opinion, is more important in political terms than the imprisonment of Lula.
Thanks. Now that everyone's about to revolt against me and Acàcio, both of us, I just want to thank the three presenters. Carl just has something to say.